You're tuned in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, guiding your gridiron journey, none other than your host, former NFL lineman, Ross Tucker.
Oh, yeah, it is. But it's not just any Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It is a teaching tutorial Thursday. What does that mean? That means class is in session with Professor Greg Cosell from NFL Films University. The legend continues our series that people absolutely loved last year, where we're starting to do a divisional preview each week of some of the things that Greg finds interesting about these teams and their schemes heading into the season, since they're all out there at OTAs practicing right now. Today, it's AFC North. Last week, it was the AFC West. As a reminder, we got a long weekend coming up. What does that mean? That means you have plenty of time to listen to the other Ross Tucker Football Podcast this week if you didn't already. I would highly encourage you to listen to yesterday's Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Fantasy Feast with Joe Dolan yesterday, talking about the potential impact of the running backs and tight ends that were drafted as rookies is always fun. In fantasy football, Even Money Betting Podcast with Warren Sharp this week was just incredible. Absolutely incredible. Please, if you do nothing else the next 3 days, please listen or watch youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL, the Even Money Podcast. If you care even a little bit about the NFL schedule, it was really, really entertaining and intriguing to hear Warren's data. We will have shows on Monday, though. We'll have a fresh Ross Tucker Football Podcast Monday. We'll have a fresh college draft Monday. So when you're grilling or you're out by the pool or drinking daddy sodas, whatever it is that you do, we will have a show for you to listen. Everybody, look, I already know. I know your friends. I know your family. They want you to be playing the Ross Tucker Football Podcast in the background while you're grilling or at the pool. That is what they told me when I was talking with them. Check me out on social media at Ross Tucker NFL. Check us out at Ross Tucker Pod. As a reminder, anybody that rates and reviews the show on Apple or Spotify this week, send me an email, ross@rosstucker.com. I'll send you an autograph in the mail. How about that? Not a bad little gift for the weekend. It's Big Show time.
The Big Show.
Okay, so Greg, before we get into the AFC North, I always like to ask you about some of the news of the weeks to stay topical, stay current, whatever. Let's start with Devontae Parker retiring. Such an interesting career. First round pick, 9 years. You know, he had one really good year, I think, with the Dolphins.
Yeah.
But, you know, I guess it felt like most years, Greg, he probably was a little bit disappointing based on what people were hoping, either as a first-round pick or the contract he got or whatever. I guess I'm curious about him. I've seen stats about, you know, his lack of separation. You know, talk about him as a player, Greg, and whether or not that style of player is as popular as it was, whatever it was, 9 or 10 years ago when he got drafted.
Yeah, I mean, I think if memory serves me correctly, he was a top 15 pick. And I think he was seen, Ross, when he was drafted, as kind of your strong boundary X type receiver. Big, he could run, he had vertical ability, he could run away from coverage because he had speed for a 6'2", 6'3" receiver. And as you said, he had that one really good year with Miami. I think you probably remember he had a dominant game against the Eagles. That was the season, I believe, he had just a really big game against Philadelphia. But he got hurt a lot, and it never quite developed. You know, he was not really a refined route runner. He never became that. So essentially, he was just a big, long strider who had good speed, but was not really nuanced at all in the subtleties and refinement of route running. And eventually that caught up to him. But, you know, maybe the main thing is availability. He was hurt a lot. And again, I don't know Devontae Parker, so maybe he wasn't a worker. Maybe he didn't. I don't know that. But it never happened for him. But your larger question about that kind of receiver, I think every team would like that big boundary X receiver. That's what Drake London was when he was drafted a couple of years ago by the Falcons. That's what Rome Odunze is, the 9th pick in this year's draft. They're big, physical, contested 50-50 catch guys. They would probably say it's 80-20 when they go up and get the ball. Every team would like that boundary X receiver that can win one-on-one against quality man coverage, because the league has really kind of evolved that way with the increase in 3-by-1 sets, where there's a single receiver to the short side of the field, and he gets a lot of pure man coverage, and you want that receiver to be able to win.
That's interesting. You know what else I think, Greg? I think most people would probably look at Devontae Parker and say, nah, as the 14th overall pick, a little disappointing. You have a 9-year career in the NFL. You know, you sign like 3 or 4 contracts. You got a big I mean, you know, there's let's put it this way. There's guys that do a lot worse than that, you know, to be able to play that long and have a pretty solid career. While we're on the Miami Dolphins, it's funny, all my topics before we get to the AFC North are Miami Dolphins related. We had Raheem Mostert on the show yesterday, and I'm not, you know, I don't want to go too far with this, Greg, but I think he's one of the best speed and power combo running backs we've ever seen. I don't think he's thought of that way necessarily because he's not the biggest guy. But you know how my buddy Kyle Brandt does the angry scepter run on Good Morning Football? Have you ever heard of that or seen that?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So Raheem has like 3 or 4 of them, Greg, where he just absolutely trucks guys. But he also ran a 10-1 at Purdue.
I know he was a track
and has
guy.
the GPS. So like, I know we don't look at him as like Bo Jackson or Herschel Walker, and he's not that physically imposing of a guy, but there are not many people that have had that combo of speed and power. And I just find it fascinating that he leads the NFL in touchdowns at age 31 for the Dolphins last year.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things with him, and the reason he's not thought of that way, is because I think this past year, if I'm not mistaken, was the first time he's carried over 200 times in his career. The last 2 years with the Dolphins, he's had the most carries he's ever had. So we never think of him, Ross, as a quote-unquote feature back. Because prior to the Dolphins, my guess is, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, my guess is he's never carried more than 150 times in a season prior to the last 2 years. Therefore he was never thought about in the way you're describing him. He was always thought of as kind of a complementary piece as opposed to a feature back. Now, in the context of the Dolphins' offense under Mike McDaniel, in each of the last 2 seasons, he has been a feature back. You know, if you look at the number of carries, and like I said, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I do know he had over 200 carries this year, which was the first time in his career. My guess is in 2022, he was probably in the 175 range. That would be my guess. So for the first time now, he's in a sense being the primary back in an offense. So we're starting to see his traits in a little bit of a different light because he's being used more.
I think that's a really, really fair and interesting point. And he would be the first one to tell you he thinks that's why he's still able to play at a high level in his 30s, because he hasn't gotten that many carries.
No.
He hasn't gotten that many touches.
Yeah, he was viewed as a track guy. I mean, we remember him. He had some really good games when the Niners had their playoff run, probably 5 years ago, give or take.
NFC Championship against the Packers. I think he set the record for the Niners.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's always had moments, and he was always thought of as a speed guy, but you're correct. I mean, he runs inside a lot better than people think. You wouldn't call him a true power back, but he tries to grind for the hard yards. He's not just a guy that bounces outside.
The last thing I wanted to talk to you about, and I talked about this on social media a little bit yesterday because it's kind of related to the Eagles, and I do this Ross report. The Miami Dolphins are praising their new defensive coordinator, Anthony Weaver, and in doing so, taking shots at their old defensive coordinator, Vic Fangio. And I never ask you to get into the personal stuff or whatever. I'll talk about that later. But man, between the Dolphins defensive backs and some of their fans, they really do not think Vic Fangio is good at his job. Obviously, the Eagles disagree, right? So, what did you see from the Dolphins' defense last year? Is Fangio inflexible? Has the game passed him by a little bit? Because obviously, the Dolphins players, at least some of them, don't really feel like he put them in the best position to succeed last year.
Well, it's funny you say that because I would argue that going back to the last couple of years in Denver when he was head coach, and since then he was out for a year, obviously, I think he's kind of evolved a bit. He's playing more man coverage. Everyone thinks of Vic Fangio as a cover four quarters coach, and obviously that's probably foundationally what he's done through the years. But he plays a lot more man coverage now than he ever has. So he has evolved with the times. Again, we're not there, Ross. He's more of an old school coach. Maybe it's a personality issue. You'd have to be there every day to know that. We see a lot of those kinds of comments at this time of year from a lot of players on a lot of teams. I don't usually put a lot of stock in that. Obviously, Vic Fangio knows defensive football extremely well. That's not the issue at all. Then the question becomes sort of getting that information across to the players and having them be able to execute. I guess we'll find out with Philly, because they obviously, as you said, they think he's really good. In the year he was out, he spent a lot of time in Philadelphia. He was in the building, a lot. And he was helping and working with Jonathan Gannon 2 years ago. So Philly clearly believes that he's a very good defensive coach. I think most people would say that. So we'll see.
We'll also see how many Labatt Blue Lights I can drink this weekend, trying to take it to the next level with friends and family, living life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. It's delicious beer brought to us by Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. Greg, let's dive into the AFC North.
Okay.
And let's start with the Baltimore Ravens, where I saw that Lamar Jackson has lost some weight to be more agile. That sounds scary. Lamar Jackson more agile? How is that even possible that he could be more agile? They've got two new guys on the right side of the offensive line, it looks like, Greg. We'll see the continued evolution of the offense under Todd Monken, and they have a new D coordinator. So what aspect of the Ravens interests you the most this year, Greg?
I would say what interests me the most is the deployment of Derrick Henry, because Derrick Henry in his career has always been an eye back with the quarterback under center. That's the strength. That's what his strength has been. He does not have a ton of experience as an offset back in the gun, and I think that's what their offense essentially will be. I think with Todd Monken, we saw a lot more, and what he wants to do is line up with 11 personnel, 3 wide receivers, and clearly they've got good ones. That's the way they played a lot last year. I think that's the way they'd like to continue to play. So again, I'm very curious to see the deployment of Derrick Henry within the context of this offense. They obviously signed him, so they're going to use him. He's not going to get 8 carries a game, but it'll be interesting to see because he's always been the kind of back that kind of needs, I don't want to say a head of steam, but he needs to develop some velocity. That's the kind of runner he is. And as an eye back, you can do that much more so than as an offset back in the gun. Or maybe they'll do more pistol, which you can still run a wider variety of runs out of pistol than you can out of shotgun. So that's one thing that really interests me.
Greg, this is why you're the best. It really is. Because I hadn't really thought about that yet. You're exactly right. And my concern with Derrick Henry when he was coming out of Alabama is that it felt like if you got to him, there wasn't a lot of agility in the backfield.
No.
If you got to him in the backfield, you had a great chance for a tackle for loss. If he gets to the line of scrimmage unencumbered, good luck.
Yeah, he's not a laterally shifty back. He's not a stop and start back.
Right.
Right.
And that's okay.
He's a great look. He had 5 years that are Hall of Fame worthy. We're not saying he's not a good player,
right?
But he ran a certain way, and it'll be interesting to see how they choose to deploy him within the context of the fact that Todd Monken clearly made a transition from the Greg Roman offense, and they played a lot more 11 personnel.
And Greg, he's always been a volume guy. And I think the combination of those two things is why there wasn't as much interest in him this offseason as he was hoping.
Correct.
Because if you're going to get him, it's like, okay, are we going to do a lot of the under center eye stuff? And are we going to give this guy, 15 plus carries a game? Like, is that what we want our offense to be?
The other factor, real quick, I know, we want to get to other teams, is they ended up starting out playing a lot of 11, and they did go back to playing Patrick Ricard quite a bit for the simple reason that Lamar Jackson was more comfortable with that. Lamar Jackson was more comfortable with the offense with Ricard, and essentially you're playing with only 4 eligible receivers when Ricard is out there, but they did sort of evolve into that more simply because Lamar Jackson was more comfortable with it. But I think they'd like to be more 11 personnel. And now, don't forget, Lamar was not really there last offseason, so now he'll be there all of this offseason, and I'm not sure people think about how important that is. You know this, Ross. It's so important to be there for the off season and learn. And so I think they'd like to make that transition.
Let's talk Cincinnati Bengals, Greg. And Burrow coming off that wrist injury. They have added Mike Gesicki, no more Tyler Boyd. And the defense is pretty much the same guys for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, same coordinators. Obviously on offense it's different. They have a new coordinator there because Brian Callahan is now with Tennessee as the head coach. That number 3 receiver spot. It'll be interesting to see. They drafted Jermaine Burton out of Alabama with in their 3rd round, and I really liked his tape a lot. We'll see. They have Charlie Jones, who they drafted from Purdue a year ago, another guy that could probably fill that role. But they've actually gotten good play from Trenton Irwin over the last couple of years, kind of an unknown name, but when he's had to play for them, he's played well. We'll see. The offensive line is somewhat intact, I guess you would say. Right tackle position will be different. Gesicki's an interesting player in the context of this offense. They've been a very high percentage 11 personnel offense, close to 90% playing with 3 wide receivers. So, I don't think you sign Gesicki unless you plan on throwing him the ball because he's not an inline blocker in the run game. Now, obviously, they're going to have a different back here. I mean, they signed Zach Moss. They have Chase Brown from Illinois in his 2nd season. So the running back situation, that's a question mark at this moment in time, how that's going to play out. You're right. Defensively, they'll be very similar. Lou Anarumo is one of the best. I think he's really good in matching up to specific opponents. I think that's one of the strengths of what he does.
You got to say Andre Iosivas, too. You can't say every other receiver and not say Andre Iosivas from Princeton.
I forgot the Princeton guy.
You say Trent Irwin, Charlie Jones. You named everybody, Greg, other than
Iosivas,
my guy.
He actually played some meaningful snaps last year. I don't think he's a true slot, though. So I don't think he'd be in the running for lining up in the slot in their 11 personnel packages.
No, I agree. He's an outside guy.
Yeah.
Let's get to the Cleveland Browns. Wow. Greg, I feel like we could have done the whole segment on the Cleveland Browns. I mean, I feel like it's time for Deshaun Watson to kind of, or get off the pot here this year in Cleveland. What do you think of Watson and the Browns?
I'm being honest. I don't think anybody knows. He really hasn't played a lot of football in 3 years. So I don't think anybody knows. The hope is he's Deshaun Watson from 4 or 5 years ago, and he looked like a top 5-6 quarterback in the league, a quarterback that could play effectively from the pocket, that could make plays outside of structure. He looked like one of those guys. But it's almost impossible to know. I really don't know the answer to it. I don't think anybody does. They did trade for Jerry Jeudy. They actually have a pretty solid receiving core. Nick Chubb will be back. Let's hope he's back to being Nick Chubb because he's one of the most phenomenal, not talked about backs in the league. Wouldn't you say? I mean, when people say, "Oh, great backs," Nick Chubb, I don't hear that name flow from people's mouths very often, but he's really good and he's fun to watch. So they've got a really good O-line. It's essentially intact. It's really good. And we saw what they did defensively under Jim Schwartz a year ago. A lot of the same players, a few additions. Jordan Hicks, a veteran, will be a linebacker. He's a really solid pro who's probably played at least a decade now, I would think, in the league. So just from a personnel standpoint, this is a really solid team on both sides of the ball.
I would agree with that, and I think you make a good point about both Chubb and Deshaun Watson. I'm fascinated to see how it plays out with Watson. I almost feel like they didn't bring Flacco back because they didn't want Flacco and his success from last year hanging over Watson's head. It's like the only position where they would do that, right? Like, you don't want to have a good quarterback there because what if your starter who got the guaranteed contract has issues? You don't want people to be calling for Flacco. It's wild if you think about it.
No, I mean, I don't think anybody can answer with certainty what Deshaun Watson will be this year.
Last but definitely not least, a team I'm pretty high on here, Greg. It is the Pittsburgh Steelers, adding O-linemen like Zach Frazier, Troy Fatanu. I'm curious as to what you think the offense will look like under Arthur Smith and how you think the quarterback position plays out.
I'm fascinated by this, okay? And again, I'm not making a judgment as to who's going to be the starting quarterback. I know what they've said, but it's still May. You know, a lot of things are said now. And obviously they were said when they signed Russell Wilson or when they got Justin Fields. But, you know, based on how they drafted Fatano in the first round, Frazier in the second round, and Frazier is one of those guys who's kind of a tempo setter. He's a mauler. I don't know if you got to see him. You know, he's one of those guys. He's probably maybe not quite as good, but in some ways like Linderbaum when he came out of Iowa, the kind of guy that solidifies your O-line. And Arthur Smith, what has he been in his career? Run game, quarterback, been a factor in the run game. Let's play physically. So having said that, it seems to me, and again, I could be totally off base and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but it seems to me that Justin Fields fits better in the context of how they want to play on offense than Russell Wilson does. Because Fields gives you that run game element from the quarterback position that has always been an Arthur Smith kind of staple. So, again, then that may not be the case at all. Maybe what they've said about Russell Wilson is the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be. But, you know, just looking at track records and past history, I just find that fascinating. And like I said, I could be totally off base.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like Russell Wilson could maybe do some of the things that Tannehill did. I don't think he had Tannehill running that much. You know, maybe he would pull the ball every once in a while.
But Fields obviously gives you, a whole different element.
Yeah, no, there's no question. Greg, you are the man. That was awesome. I absolutely love this. We'll do the AFC South next week, which should be a lot of fun. Check him out on social media at Greg Cosell. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.
Tux Takes.
All right, Ross. The NFL announced that the 2026 NFL Draft will be held in Pittsburgh.
That's awesome. Absolutely love it for all those folks out there in Pittsburgh. It's funny, I was a buddy of mine's the president and CEO of Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, and that's a big deal, right? I mean, they might get 1 million people in Pittsburgh. Basically, if you live in Western Pennsylvania, how do you not go downtown for those 3 days of the draft, at least one of them? So Pittsburgh, obviously, more or less one of the birthplaces of football. I think it's fantastic that they're getting the draft. Green Bay this year, Pittsburgh the year after. That's the way it should be. These cities that aren't going to get Super Bowls, give them the draft.
And then I saw you comment on social media about Dolphin safety Javon Holland. He had some remarks on former defensive coordinator Vic Fangio and then their current DC, Anthony Weaver.
Right. So because I do some work for the Eagles, including the preseason games, I do these Ross reports. It's a minute or less on social media just talking about the Eagles every week. It's actually daily during the season. And I saw where Javon Holland was asked about Anthony Weaver. He said it's a total 180. He said he's a good person. We'll start with that. Boy, I really don't care for that comment from Javon Holland. To say someone's a bad person, boy, you better have some really good evidence of them being a bad person to say that publicly. And honestly, even if you feel that way, just the lack of professionalism to say that publicly. There's plenty of coaches I didn't like. There's plenty of coaches I didn't think were good people. I didn't say that publicly like that. And I know Vic Fangio a little bit. I've talked to him a couple of times. He's not a smiler, Jack. He's not going to smile. I mean, he is like an old school Northeast Pennsylvania guy. And I think he's old school, right? Like, I'm the coach, you're the player. And maybe that doesn't resonate as much with certain players. Although, I don't know, Jalen Carter came out yesterday and said he was training in Miami, and the guy said really good things about Vic Fangio. So I guess we'll see how it plays out. Just not a fan of calling out someone personally like that. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Make sure to also check out Even Money, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network on Samsung TV Plus, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
Shout out myfrontpagestory.com. Father's Day is now a couple weeks away. Boy, your dad would love this. I'm just telling you, he would love it. myfrontpagestory.com. Big fan as well of backoffescheduler.com, steakhousesports.com, humanheadnyc.com, sporticulture,